we step away from the din to debate what American government should do and what it does well. We're here with a live studio audience at the Night Studio in the museum. And with me on this stage, some of the leading lights in American political thought. On the right, House Budget Committee Chairman Congressman Paul Ryan of Wisconsin and ABC's own George Will. And on the left, Congressman Barney Frank of Massachusetts, who's just announced that this term in Washington will be his last. And Robert Reich, Bill Clinton's Labor Secretary, now teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. Gentlemen, we have a lot of ground to cover today, and we want to leave time for questions. And so we're asking you to keep answers quite tight, and you'll be allowed a moment or two for rebuttal. We kick things off with brief opening statements. First, Congressman Ryan.
Thank you, Christiane. Is there too much government in our lives? Yes. Ask most people and they will agree. It's no coincidence that government spending has hit record levels while people's trust in government has hit record lows. So the longer answer, why is this, is pretty simple. Too much government inevitably leads to bad government. When government grows too much and extends beyond its limits, it usually does things poorly. Our founders put limits on government because they knew the limits of government. The left usually likes to advance what I would call a strawman argument or a false choice, that those of us who believe in the constitutional principles of limited government somehow favor sort of a Hobbesian state of nature or a social Darwinism, where people are left to fend for themselves completely, only to be exploited by the few who are powerful, and that the only alternative to this cruel society is a vision of a society of total security and total outcome results guaranteed by government. Fortunately, this is not the case. Those of us who believe in limited government also believe in effective government. A good and popular government is one that respects its limits, is one that fulfills its goals and its functions well. But look at where we are today. Look at our economy. Look at our debt, crony capitalism, where government is picking winners and losers, where you have big government and big business exchanging favors with one another, while the entrepreneur and the small business person is left struggling to survive. The last few years have shown us that a truly effective government is impossible without limits. A government that focuses on equalizing the results of our lives is one that does damage to the American commitment of equal opportunity. If we reclaim our founding timeless principles, we will have a government that we have faith in, that we are proud of. And the question surrounding the size and the proper size of government will take care of itself.
Congressman Ryan, thank you very much. And Congressman Barney Frank, your opening minute and a half.
Yes, we have too much government, and yes, we have too little government. There is this mistaken view that says, you know, we have a fight between the people's money and the government's money. It's all the people's money. The question is, as people, intelligently, we have two sets of needs. We have needs that we best pursue individually with money for ourselves and our families, and we can make personal choices. But then there are things that we have to do together. I understand the appeal of tax cuts, but in all my years of government, I've never seen a tax cut put out a fire. I've never seen a tax cut build a bridge or clean up toxic atmosphere. The point is that there are some things where we are inevitably together. We are interlocked in the economy. We are all subject to the same environment. We all have the same public safety needs. And there, I think, we have sometimes had too little government. On the other hand, and my conservative friends who claim that they are for small government are the ones who tell us that an adult shouldn't be able to gamble on the internet. We have the leading judicial conservative, Antonin Scalia, absolutely in a snit because you can't be sent to jail if you have personal sexual relations of which he does not approve. We have a series of interventions by the conservatives in those choices that should be left to individuals. So my conservative friends have it absolutely backwards. I do want there to be regulation so that you don't have the kind of manipulation in the financial area that leads to crises. And I do want to be able to clean up the environment. No matter how rich you are, you can't get your own air to breathe. On the other hand, as I said, there are overreaches by the conservatives. And by the way, they include militarily. I think we have a wonderful military full of able young people, very well equipped, and they can stop bad things from happening. but they are not really good at making good things happen in foreign societies. And it is on the whole my conservative friends who want us to be rebuilding other societies where we're not very good at it. So the answer is yes, we should have more government where we need, in an interactive way, to protect ourselves against abuses, but there should be more personal choice. And so that's the current situation. And so my answer is yes, I want more government involved in economic regulation and environmental cleanup and in provision of public safety. I want less government telling me what personal choices to make as an individual.
Congressman, thank you very much. So you've heard both sides open up with their premise. And let me ask you, Robert Reich, about the distrust and the fear of government. It's at record highs right now, and a recent Gallup poll shows that about 64% of Americans, including 48% Democrats, feel that a big government is the biggest threat to the future of this country, as compared with only 26% thinking that big business is the biggest threat to the future of this country. Isn't that your problem?
Well, it's not my problem personally. Christiane, I think that this country has never in our history embraced the idea of big government. We don't like to think that we want big government. The idea of big government as a framing device in terms of debates such as this inevitably sets it up kind of in favor of the side that doesn't want much big government. As my debating partner just said, the issue is really not so much how big the government is, it's what government does. It's who government is for. And I think a lot of us are worried that government is doing the wrong things. It is not only invading personal space. I mean, look at what Alabama and also Arizona have done with regard to allowing police to stop almost anybody who looks Latino on the suspicion that they may not be here legally in this country. We want a government that actually does protect the right things. You mentioned distrust. Well, people distrust government. But how many people trust Wall Street these days? How many trust big corporations? How many trust the economic system? A Pew Foundation poll just done, the results were just indicated Friday, said that 77% of Americans think the economy is unfair, the dice are loaded, essentially the game is rigged in favor of the rich.
You talked about what the government should be doing. So let me ask you, one of the big issues, obviously, that we've been debating all year is election. This election is jobs, the jobs crisis. There are something like nearly 23 million people who are either unemployed, underemployed, or out of the workforce. And of course, during the Great Depression, the government did create big programs to get people back to work. Why shouldn't they do that right now? Why shouldn't there be that kind of activity?
First of all, because it didn't work during the Depression. The cardinal aim of the New Deal was to put the country back to work. Unemployment never came below 14% until we geared up to be the arsenal of democracy in the Second World War. We've had a remarkably clear test under the Obama administration. They said pass the stimulus, and by 2011, the economy would be growing at 4%, and unemployment would be 7.1% and falling. I do not fault the president for having his economic projections wrong. This is a complicated society. John Kenneth Galbraith, one of your liberal friends, once said that the purpose of economic projections is to make astrology look respectable. I don't fault the president for this. I fault the president for thinking that society is transparent and easy to regulate, just as I don't fault the president for making a slew of horrible investments in green energy and all the rest, Solyndra and other companies. I don't fault him for that because no one expects the political class to be good at disposing money in the most productive ways.
Well, can I respond to that? Because, in fact, one of the most successful things we've done recently is to keep the American automobile industry alive. Yes, Solyndra was a mistake, but there was a major liberal conservative fight about whether or not we should inject funding into the American automobile industry. And as a result of that injection of funding, we have a thriving American automobile industry today that would have been in collapse. And it's interesting that Ford Motor Company, that was not looking for any of that money because they had prudently put aside some money, ardently argued for money to go to Chrysler and General Motors, which are now alive and thriving, and there is significant employment. The American automobile industry is stronger than it's been in a long time because of a judicious intervention of federal funding. As to the stimulus, yes, they over-argued, but the fact is quite clear. Things are better than they would have been. Now, I understand it is not a good political slogan to say things would have been worse without me. You don't win on that. But it is clear, and I say that less politely in other forums, but it is clear that the economic intervention that we did early in 2009 reduced the damage. The president underestimated the difficulty we had in the economy. But when you talk about interventions, the intervention into the American automobile industry has been very successful. It has promoted employment. It has promoted and kept alive an American automobile industry that would have been badly crippled if we hadn't done that.
Congressman Ryan, you actually voted for the Wall Street bailout and indeed the auto bailout as well.
Right,
Something
the auto
that's
bailout in order to
infuriated
prevent TARP from going to the auto companies, because we already put $25 billion aside in an energy bill, which I disapproved of, to go to auto companies. The point I would say with the auto bailout is we've created a moral hazard now. Now we've said if you're really big and you drive your company into a ditch, don't worry about it because the federal government might just bail you out the next time around.
No,
the other point I would simply say is a counterfactual is impossible to disprove, which is it would have been much better if we didn't do all these things. It's not possible to disprove these things, but I would simply say when we have deep recessions in this country, usually we come out of it really growing very quickly, like we did in the 70s and the 80s. This recession, we are not recovering very well. Look at how high our unemployment is. Look at how few jobs have been created.
Do you think the automobile intervention was successful or not?
I think we should have done a bankruptcy because what we're doing now by saying to bondholders, look out, if you're not on the right side of the politicians in Washington, you might lose your money. And so we're violating the rule of law.
I don't see any company today that feels that they can be reckless and be bailed out. As a matter of fact,
well, I know you believe that.
We're letting companies fail all the time. There's no such moral hazard.
Can I break out of form and agree with Paul Ryan on one very important issue? And that is, I think the Wall Street bailout, if we had to do it again, certainly that bailout would have had strings attached.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Those Wall Street banks would have been required to help homeowners, would have been required to put caps on executive salaries, would have been limited in terms of the lobbying they could do to prevent Wall Street regulation. Now, would you have voted for that, Paul Ryan?
With those strings?
With those strings
no, I would have
attached?
put different strings on it. I would have said stick to the financial services sector. Don't go into these other areas that you just mentioned. That was the whole part of TARP. And it was to take toxic assets, not to buy stock in
companies. A brief
companies.
sentence. We did vote for the bill. The bill you described is the one we voted for. The Bush administration decided that it was so important to get the buy-in from the financial industry that they ignored significant pieces that tried to
And we have a
do
question from our audience. We're going to go to you on financial services.
Yes, good morning. Larry Parnell, a professor at GW's Graduate School of Political Management. My question really has to do with what has been put in place since those days to prevent this happening again for consumers and investors to take some comfort from what we've learned in the past few years.
I will be glad to respond because we have in fact gone from being accused of not dealing with too big to fail to now overdoing it, and we are now being accused of being too stingy to bail. The Economist did a simulation and said if there's another crisis, we won't be able to bail people out. The Federal Reserve gave money to AIG under Section 13.3. We abolished that in the bill. That no longer exists. We also said that if a company fails, in the first place, it is, if it can't pay its debts, it is abolished. Sarah Palin was half right, which for her was a good average. We had death panels in the legislation that we passed, but they were for large financial companies. If a financial company cannot pay its debts, it is abolished. Okay. The federal government can then step in and pay some of the debts, but it is mandated to recover any of those debts that are paid, and they can pick and choose and pay only as little as they need to keep there from being contagion, and that is all recovered not from the taxpayer, but from other financial institutions.
Surely it should be axiomatic that if you're too big to fail, you're too big to exist, because the country is then held hostage to you.
George, how small would you make every bank? Should no bank be so big that if it failed, it would be a problem? How small would you get the banks?
Below whatever threshold we determine.
Well, what is that threshold, George? You're advocating a policy. Would you break up every bank in America?
I'd break up the big banks.
Ones.
And to what size? To what size? Because here's the problem. People say that. You would have, because Canada has 5 banks, and if they're well regulated, that doesn't cause a problem. But no one's told me to what size. The answer is not that if you're too big. What we have said is this: if you fail, that's okay because that's your money, as long as it's not the taxpayers' money. And that's what we have done is to say that if you fail, you're out of business. We may pay some of the debts, but it comes from other financial institutions.
This is a terrific example of where so-called liberals and conservatives actually are not on polarized opposites. I mean, I happen to think that we should cap the size of big banks. Big banks are bigger today than they were before the Wall Street bailout. I think that we ought to use the antitrust laws to make sure that banks don't get too big. And bankruptcy laws. And bankruptcy laws as well. So where is the liberal? Where is the conservative position? So we are in the habit, all of us, of being on exactly opposite sides, but when you actually look underneath the surface, there is much more in common.
That's not true. That's altogether partly right, but here's our problem with this approach. We are amplifying too big to fail. We are saying that if the government deems you systemically risky, you're the one that's going to get bailed out. And so what's going to happen as a result of that? Barney, please let me finish. So what are we saying? We are saying to the big banks, you're going to get the capital that's cheaper. We're going to have 7 Fannie Mae and Freddie Macs instead of 2, and the small banks are going to be left on the outside looking in. We are stacking the deck in favor of the big banks instead of the small banks. That is entirely inaccurate. I totally disagree with that, Barney, because you just said a couple things. Government gets to pick and choose. We are putting more power in the hands of discretionary bureaucrats so that they can decide how to run these big companies, and the markets know that if things go down, we will bail them out. No, I've read the bill 3 times.
Here's what the bill says. Here's what the first place you say break them up. No one has told me to what sides, and you do have an international competitive aspect. I don't want there to be no American financial institution that's capable of competing with all the international ones. Secondly, what we have said is this: we will be regulating them. The regulators are empowered to make them divest if they think in a particular case they're too big. There are caps on the amount of deposits they can take. But finally, if all that fails, and they have to have more capital for the big banks and the small ones, but if that fails, they are put out of business. They are not too big to fail. We then will pick and choose to see what debts we may pay. But the bank is done. The shareholders are wiped out. Everybody is fired. There is no moral hazard. There is no more institution.
You just made our case.
All right. And on that note, then, in the next segment,
there's no institution for who's too big to fail.
And the only people who can hire the legion of lawyers and compliance officers to deal with all of this are the big businesses and the small businesses.
Nonsense. They are put out of business.